We are honored to have Dr. Larry Connor for the first New York Bee Wellness webinar. Several years ago, he taught our first New York Bee Wellness Train the Trainer workshops. So now, without further ado, I present Dr. Larry Connor.
Talk about spring conditions and swarm conditions and everything we're all dealing with at this time of year. I hope you all got out to check your bees today. It looks like most of the country had pretty good weather. We certainly have made a lot of progress since we had snow last, which was what, 2 weeks ago here in Michigan. And probably 5 weeks ago, we had our first of our maples, which in our area was one of the first pollen and nectar sources. So you have both red maple, sugar maple, and especially silver maple, which produce a lot of pollen and nectar. Can everyone hear me okay, Pat?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay, all right, fine. So some of you probably did some feeding. You were using pollen or protein patties that usually don't have any pollen in them. And fairly soon you're going to be in a situation where the bees are going to produce a lot of pollen, gather a lot of pollen, and store new nectar. And it may not be as pretty as this. It may look more like this. So here we have some pollen that's being collected. You can see a few drones on there. This was from Kentucky about a week or so ago. And it just shows you that spring is on its way and the reproductive instincts of the beehive are pretty well established. Now, sometime back in January, February, your colony should have started producing a new brood. And initially that would have been a fairly small patch of brood. Here you see the bottom of that slide shows a few cells that are sealed. So there's already been brood present in this particular frame. But as we go into our colonies now, we're going to see more like this, where you've got sealed brood, you've got younger brood on the outside, might have some pollen in the honey on the upper right and left-hand corners. The worker bees are busy with taking care of the brood. They're doing a lot of feeding. You see this one bee that has her head into the cell. She's probably providing some brood food for the larvae that's inside. Of course, they feed royal jelly for the first roughly 2 days, and then they go to a brood food, which has more pollen and maybe some other things in there with it. So here's some sealed brood. You see a couple of cells that look like they may have emerged, and that's what we have here. We have a worker bee that is emerging from the cell. So this is what we'd expect to see in the spring. And if you have overwintered colonies, this is what you're going to have. If you're starting out with packages or nucs, you're just getting into this for the first time, then you're going to anticipate seeing this over the next couple of weeks. We're going to see a lot of white comb. This is going to be the beeswax. The beeswax is going to be formed in the comb, and the bees are going to start filling the cells with a lot of nectar, which they convert into honey, and that is eventually going to be part of the honey crop. So we have all these resources coming in, and this is probably one of the key things that is important for us to consider when we think about the normal instincts to swarm. Swarming takes place pretty much based on a heat degree day formula, but of course that's going to change by your latitude. So at the bottom you can see Louisiana has a peak sometime in March and April, where in New York State, we're just now starting the swarm season. So you see you've got a variety of variation here. And keep in mind, we see a lot of curves nowadays because of the virus, but this changes according to the season we're having, which is a combination of the heat units we're getting outside and the plant's response to those heat units and producing pollen and nectar. Then the bees are responding to that by producing the swarms. But they just don't snap. Well, I guess they don't have fingers, so they can't snap a tarsi. But they don't just immediately decide that. There's a variety of things that happen. First of all, you do have the buildup in the resources we just mentioned. You also have the production of drones and queen cells, which start out as queen cups. So here you see an egg in the bottom of this queen cup that's been pulled away. And this is what defines the difference to me between a queen cup and a queen cell. Once there's an egg present, then we will call it a queen cell, even though there's no larvae there yet. Bee eggs, we thought for many years that there was no difference between a egg and a queen cell and a worker cell, but some people have got some evidence now that there may be some differences there. I don't know who took this photo, but it's a great one I got off the internet. So if you're out there, thank you. So what we see though is an expanded brood area. We see here, we've got some worker brood, a few drone cells, those are the ones that stick out more. And we see one queen. Well, is it a cup or is it a cell? Well, it's a cell if it's got an egg or larvae in there. And at this time of year, you're going to check your bees, your overwintered colonies, to see if they have any queen cells or cups. And the number of cups in that colony will increase before swarming. There are probably cups present in most colonies on a year-round basis, but the number increases prior to swarming, and the bees will start producing queen cells. And I'm not sure what we can see. You know, they'll produce a lot of cells, but eventually we'll get to the point that you'll have developing queen larvae inside these cells. This one, of course, has been cut open. And you can see that the bees have provided a surplus of royal jelly for that larvae to feed on. She's going to feed on that, probably consume most, if not all of it. And then she's going to start to spin a cocoon inside that cell. Here's an enchant shot that I got of a larvae, that queen larvae that's actually, you can see the silk there that she's been producing. So she's in the process of starting this pre-pupation behavior of producing the silk that's going to then go lead her to pupate. And then she's start the process of converting from the larvae to a pupae. Once we see queen cells in this swarming behavior, we can see a mixture of ages. Now the queen, the old queen, is the one who lays the eggs into those cells. But if you look at this frame carefully, you'll see that there's some cells that are sealed, some that have been emerged from already. There's one in the upper left, and there's one in the lower right, where you can see that the queen has emerged, and part of the cell has already been chewed away in the upper left. And this indicates that the bees are active. They're active in their swarm season. You'll see this where colonies are going to produce more than one swarm, or the primary and after swarms, or secondary or tertiary swarms, depending on how you want to label them. And there may be 3 or 4 cells that are produced by these bees over a period of time. To do that, the bees will sometimes keep the queens confined in the cells and let a few come out at a time. So one of the experiences I've had is that you open up a colony that's at this state, and that can happen this time of year, that you suddenly see a lot of young queens and virgin queens running around. So it can be pretty disturbing, and you're diving for anything you can put a queen into, holding one between your teeth if you have to. I'm not saying you really do that. So here's a beekeeper who's checking for condition of the queen cells, looking, see if there's any present. If there are any cells, how far along they are. Now, swarming is timed by the age of these cells. So as soon as you see sealed cells like this, the collective wisdom of the beekeepers I've met over the years say, once you see queen cells at this stage, your colony is probably already swarmed. or is swarming while you're doing this, because it is something that can happen rather dramatically. A lot of people will say, well, gee, I've been in my beehive and I see emerged queen cells, but they got a lot of bees. And yes, that's the answer. They do leave a lot of bees behind. They don't take them all. So there's a great deal of crowding in that hive before the first swarm leaves. So when we go into our colony and we look at it, this queen that is being produced here most likely is going to be the new queen of this particular colony. The old queen has gone with the swarm. So here's a new queen cell that has started to emerge. This is a series from Steve Rapatsky. I think a couple of these ended up in his book. And here you see the queen. She's cut a flap in the queen cell that, well, then cut it all off. I don't know, being neat and tidy, I guess. And then the queen crawls out. Sometimes somebody gave me this slide from somebody else, and I don't know who to give credit to, but you can see at least half a dozen queen cells that have emerged. You see the flaps hanging down, and you can see that these all have come out. And while we think of queens being interested in killing their sisters, during the swarming process, it appears that the worker bees keep the workers, or keep the queens separated so that they are less likely to go after a sister until they finish the swarming process. And then, you know, the knives come out. Once the bee has, the swarm has, a secondary swarm and an after swarm has arrived at a new location, then you'll have the queens fighting. Sometimes you see cells that look like this. This is probably in a colony that's going through the supersedure process, not the swarming process. Because what has happened here is that an older queen has come out first. She's gone around looking for her rival sisters. She's chewed a hole in the side of this cell, backed up, stung that queen. She doesn't die in the process of stinging her. And then the queen inside dies. The bees will pull this body out, and then the bees will tear down the cell eventually. With queen rearing, of course, you've got a opportunity to produce queens on your own. This slide shows you a couple of things that are worth noticing. First of all, you see the royal jelly and the plastic base. So that tells us that these cells, while they have, the bees have finished capping the cells, the larvae inside has not finished feeding on the royal jelly because of the amount of royal jelly which is present. And in a day or two, they will consume most of this royal jelly and then spin the cocoon and then pupate. And on about the 16th day, then they'll emerge as queens. This just shows you the some cells that have emerged. You can see that the bees have chewed down on the wax, removed part of the wax from the tip of the cell, and they may have done this before these queens emerged in an attempt to get closer to the queen inside and the queen pheromone, the queen substance that she's producing. Another couple of things are going on at the swarming season we need to keep in mind. At different times of the year, you'll see bees put nectar and pollen, but primarily nectar, into the center of a brood area that the bees have just emerged from. And the name we use for that is backfilling. And the bees are actually putting in nectar, probably because there's a nectar flow on, and the bees are competing for space. And so this is going to prevent the queen from laying a lot of eggs at that particular time. But at any eggs she were to produce now, probably wouldn't help during the nectar flow. Well, during the swarm season, the bees are going to do the same thing. And just before the swarm leaves, as the brood emerges, the bees are going to plug in those cells with the nectar, and the queen is going to be slowed down in her egg laying. She's also going to be put on a diet and moved around a little bit. Certain bees are going to chase after her, and that way she'll be light enough to fly. We also see pollen coming in here, and this is a good slide. This is the one I used before or not. This that shows you the good mixture of pollen colors and so forth. Of course, the number of bees in the colony, and people say, well, gee, I just bought a nuc and it swarmed, and that is not unusual to have colonies that are in a small box that have been made up strong, and the beekeeper who gets this box of bees has been a little delayed in getting them moved into 8 or 10 frame equipment. They confine the bees. You get the bees bearding on the outside, and if that continues, then that colony may actually go into swarming. Old timers would say, well, I'm going to clip the wing of the queen and keep the queen from swarming. And all that does is slow the bees down a little bit, because the mother queen that's in that hive, she's going to stay at home, and her daughters, one of her daughters will emerge and leave with a swarm, or several of her daughters. I've seen pictures of after swarms, or swarms like this where the queen couldn't leave, where there were as many as a dozen virgin queens that were kicked out of the hive once they started fighting and killing each other. Here's a great slide that you've seen from Tom Seeley, some of you, and Tom's at Cornell. He does a lot of work on nest site. Most of our natural bee trees are fairly small. They're about the equivalent of a single deep Langstroth beehive. And so that's not a lot of room. And while you can manage bees like that, one of the things you're going to be fighting then is this instinct to swarm. So bees can swarm, they'll end up on a really nice branch close to the ground so you can reach it, shake the bees into a box, which makes it all very nice. Here's a larger swarm. This was actually in Hawaii. And when you see swarms like this, it's pretty nice to have those bees. Unfortunately, my bees always swarm to the top of the 25-foot pine trees that I have around the house here in Kalamazoo. So, you know, we can wave at them and they can wave back, but we can't really get after them very well, unless somebody comes by with a cherry picker. All right, so we have a new queen in our parent colony. We have the old queen, maybe, in the swarm colony, and that's the instinct that we're fighting. And wherever you are, and depending on what your bee conditions are, you could be in the middle of the swarm season right now. So, Pat, could we ask that question about the, have people seen swarms yet? I don't know how to do that. Okay, here we go. So we'll give you a minute or two. Have any of your colonies swarmed so far? So go ahead and answer that, and we'll post the results. And as Pat said, nobody knows who's answering with what information. While we're waiting for you to answer, just want to thank several people for some of the slides: Steve Rapaski, Dorothy Morgan, Tom Seeley, Bo Stark, my brother Mike Connor, and probably my son as well, Andrew Connor, and some people that borrowed their slides off the internet. Okay, so let's go ahead. If you haven't answered the questions, so here we are. We had 34 that have had colonies that have already swarmed. We've had 167 who say no, 8 that are being honest, they have no idea, and 20 that decided not to answer. All right, so we'll go ahead and close that. So I'm going to get out of this talk, if I can, and move on to another. Hold on here. All right. Technical snap of time. Okay, there we go. All right, so moving on, we're going to talk about ways that you can make colonies from the bees you already have. You've reviewed the swarming behavior. So we can go ahead and take a look at some of these things. Any of you want to contact me, there's my email address and our website. So feel free to jot that down and send me an email when this is all over. So let's talk about why make increased colonies and how the increased colonies are, as I'll say in a minute, mean making new colonies. So you're going to use the bees you have, and by doing that, you may relieve the bees from swarming. And if you've been relying on packaged bees to get new colonies, it may give you some freedom from getting packages or getting as many packages. It will give you the opportunity to use some localized bee stock. A lot of people think that's important. It'll help you perhaps make some money with your beekeeping. And we have another question coming up on the cost of, or the value of nucs. So we'll get to that in a few minutes. So you could perhaps use this to support your beekeeping habit. As we said, this is Mother Nature's way of making increase. Bees are called superorganisms. And by saying that, we mean that they're a social insect. They have no ability to reproduce that individual colony other than through swarming. So this is an instinct, and it reproduces the entire superorganism that we're calling beehive. Now, beekeepers call increased colonies all sorts of things: nucleus colonies, nukes, splits, divides, set-offs, nucs, walkaway splits, nucking, depending on where you are, what your accent is. It's not important. There's a colony that's actually swarming. This was in June in Connecticut a couple of years ago. And this colony is doing great. It's done so great that it's producing a swarm. And turn the camera 90 degrees and you have the light hitting these bees. It's a pretty dramatic experience, pretty innocent experience too. You can be standing in the middle of the swarm. Those bees are not at all defensive. And so this is a loss to you as a beekeeper, although it's probably a good thing for the environment, keeping lots of bee colonies out there to supplement Mother Nature, supplement what beekeepers are doing. What we want to do is redirect Mother Nature, and we want to use some queen cells that are appearing naturally. So if you go into a colony and you find queen cells that haven't emerged, here you see one that's got the flap, but one next to it that does not, then you can say, well, gee, I could use that queen cell and make a new colony. And people might say, oh, well, gee, you're going to be selecting for the swarming instinct. And, you know, my argument there is that all colonies eventually will swarm. at least any good colony that I've ever run into. So we'll worry about that later. You could always requeen the colony. So here we have an opportunity. And as you approach the other major instinct for bees to produce queens, and that's the supersedure instinct, that you might have fewer queen cells, but if you leave one for the queen or for the colony, and you might have another one on another frame, you could use that to make up a new colony. Supersedure colonies quite often can be weaker, so you have to be a little more careful here. But you could use the queen from one colony and bees from another. The other option is to produce queens using what we call the grafting method or the Doolittle method. Or you could purchase queens. Here's some bees that have come in from California, Hawaii, someplace. They've got loose bees in there to keep the queen cells fed and warm. And so if you're purchasing queen cells or virgins or mated queens, or you could raise your own queens, make your own queen cells, use virgin queens, or use mated queens. You might take a class in beekeeping and discover that in the course of that class, you can pay for the cost of the class, if you produce your own queens, as few as 10 queens. One of the things I just wanted to mention here is the use of 48-hour queen cells. This is an idea that some people have hopped on and have had good luck with. And I've been surprised how easy it is. Basically, 48-hour queen cells are shippable. You don't have to ship them with bees. You don't have to keep them insulated. You literally just have a plastic strip here. You cut a groove in that strip that you can put queen cups, either these plastic or the JZBZ cups, or you could use beeswax cups that have these flanges on there that would hold the cell tight. And then you're going to use 48-hour queen cell. That's approximate. You can have some variation in here. And why you're going to do that, here's some queen cells that are a little older than 48 hours, but why you use this age is multiple reasons. First of all, these are pretty well all the way fed. They probably have at least 80% of all the royal jelly they're ever going to get is already in that cell at 2 days after the egg hatches. Secondly, the larvae are fairly small. They're not big enough. If you ever watch bees that are in stress, they'll sometimes their larvae will try to wiggle out of the cell. Well, these larvae are still being held in there because of surface tension, so they're fairly safe. So the person who taught me this method was Dr. John Kiefer. He lives in Toulouse, France, and he would put these cells like this into real cells, not the ones just for demonstration, into a bread wrapper, horrors of horrors, a French bread wrapper, not stuck underneath the armpit, but in a plastic bag. Everything's so sanitized. So anyway, he'd put these queen cells onto the high-speed train in Toulouse that left at 11 o'clock at night. And those queen cells would go to Paris and arrive at 7 o'clock in the morning. And the beekeepers in Paris would meet somewhere and divide up their queen cells. And so by noon that next day, those cells are all inside nucs. And so you can see that you have this cell was put into this nuc. I did it myself, and they finished this cell. So it was a queenless colony I made up with some young bees, 2 frames of brood, and they finished the queen cell. So it's a way of developing a technique, really, to transfer queens from one place to another. And in John Kiefer's case, it was the ability to obtain some of his genetic stock, which he was selling these queen cups, 48-hour queen cells, queen cells for €5 each. At that point, it was about $7.50. And his breeder queens were being sold at that point for €500. So it was a way for people to obtain good genetic material at a fairly low cost. So now we can move on. And most beekeepers that I know are using a technique of using some sort of mating nuc or a mating nuc slash increased nuc, and either using them for mating if they're raising queens, or just making up these cells, these colonies, for production themselves. So here's an operation in Texas. It's up against the French row because the wind in Texas in the spring gets pretty strong. The equipment here was all equipment that somebody had salvaged from a commercial beekeeper's burn pile and rebuilt it and fitted it up. So what do we got? 9 or 10 mating nucs per pallet, and they have a glass jar on top that fits in the lid. And if you take that lid off, you can go look right into the colony. The advantage of this system is that you can give a fairly small group of bees, probably start out with 2 frames of brood, a frame of honey, and a frame of foundation or 2. If you have it, you should use a frame of pollen as well. And then by feeding the bees 2 or 3 times, you can give them a lot of sugar syrup. The bees will build up in the spring. You get the queens mated. And here you see the wax. This is a wax cell on the lower, above the 530 position. And you see this is a way, if you've harvested a queen, you can put another queen in there. If you're just doing this once, then you can set this up, come back, lift off the jar, put in the queen cell, and then put the jar back on with the sugar syrup, and you're all set. Good method, works well in many parts of the country. I've used techniques like that in several places, found them to be fairly successful. I played a little bit around with the technique that several people have used. Kirk Webster and Mike Palmer and others now are promoting this, and that's the double nuc. And that's basically a 10 frame box with a solid piece of wood in the middle. And then you have 2 nucs. And this next slide shows you what the top one looks just the same as the bottom one there on the left, because if you turn them around, they should be identical. And that's the point of this. But you make these up with 2 frames of brood, frame of honey, and a frame of pollen, add a queen cell, and you should be off to a good colony. So here you have a plastic red queen cell. You can see that's been put in there. That's a ripe cell. The queen will emerge in the next few hours. Notice also that they're using a feed bag for their inner cover, and there's propolis on that feed bag. So this allows you to open up one side without exposing the bees on the other. So you don't have the chance of a queen crawling over that divider and getting into trouble with the neighbors. One of the things I like about this, and the term Connecticut nuc came from bee culture editor Kim Flottam. If you make up a nuc in April, you're going to see an expansion of the brood cycle sometime about the first week or 2 of May. There'll be a slight decline as some of the founder bees are going to die out. But then you see things really take off. So that's one of those curves we've been told is bad. For a beehive, it's good. So here we see them taking off. And you have, if that queen's producing 1,200 or 1,500 eggs per day, you probably get 90% of them emerging 3 weeks later. So you see you have a really rapid buildup. In this particular model, you see that we've got over 35,000 bees. on July 1st, and that's a pretty nice colony. That would be probably in 2 deeps, 8 or 10 frame boxes. And if you're using 5 frame nuc boxes, that's probably 3 or 4 boxes of bees and honey and brood and everything else. And that's up to you. You can do whatever you want. I've seen in my career 3 frame, 4 frame, 5 frame, 8 frame, 10 frame nucs made up as new hives. And they can be in deep or medium. They also can be in Kenya top hire hives, the coffin hives. Just make a smaller version so you've got that to work with. So here the beekeeper is holding a frame of brood that you can very nicely make increase with. And in southern locations, you can do some mating. This is one with Dave Mixa in Florida. He has 3 frame nucs that he's using for mating. But the bees have a separated, there's a queen excluder on top, and they share their honey super. They don't fight. So it's a pretty amazing system. So you have a lot of flexibility here. And my suggestion to all of you that are saying, should I experiment? And I say yes. Give it a try, see how 1 or 2 work for you, and then you can decide if that's what you really want to do on a larger scale. One of the things most people have to deal with, and we'll talk about that in just a minute, is finding the queen. My suggestion in queen finding is to become very sequential and to take the outer frame out and very carefully examine that frame and set that into an empty box. And as you work that frame, you rotate it so that you're looking at all sides and all angles of that frame. And if there are a lot of bees piled up, gentle pump of smoke, or sometimes your hive tool will move the bees to make sure that you've actually seen all the bees are there to look for the queen. And then work from frame 1 to frame 8 or 10, depending on what your equipment looks like, so that you have a better chance of finding the queen. If you have bees in multiple boxes and you absolutely, positively have to find that queen, then I suggest you put a queen excluder between the boxes, and that will confine the queen. And 4 days later, she'll be in the box that has the eggs, if all things are following plans. So, excuse me, here's a marked queen. You can mark queens as virgins. You can mark queens after they've come back and mated. Paint will wear off. You can clip wings. That wings don't grow back. Many of you would probably be wise just to mark your queen, learn how to do it, practice on drones, and then you've got some pretty drones flying around for a while. Well, pretty in my opinion. And because that drop of paint, even on a cloudy day, makes it easier to spot that queen. So we're going to take out our 2 or 3 frames of brood. We're going to set it aside, and you've got options here. You could just take out a couple of frames from one colony. You could take a nice colony and divide it up and make 3, 4, 5, 6 increased colonies from one. So if you've got 8 frames of brood, you could put 2 in each and you'd end up with 4 colonies. If you had 12, you could have 3 or 6 colonies. So you could just do the math and then equalize the resources. So with a little practice, if you do that sort of thing though, it's always good to put the bees facing the same general direction as the original entrance. And if one colony gets more bees than another, you simply swap the strongest colony with the weakest colony and move from there. A lot of people in Michigan here like to let their bees raise their own queen. And I think many people call them walk-away splits. And you simply move bees in, you don't look for the queen, and you walk away and say, okay, they'll raise their own queen and we'll be fine. Well, let's do the math on that. So if you've got a freshly mated queen, you buy it from somebody here in state, she should start laying eggs in a day or maybe a maximum of 5 days. If you get a mated queen from a queen bank where her ovaries have shrunken, then it's going to take a little bit longer, 4 to 10 days. If you've got a 7-day-old virgin queen, it's going to take probably more like 10 days for that queen to start producing eggs if she mates. And that's always a big question. If you have a ripe queen cell where you add another 5 days onto that, maybe 7 days. If you use that 48-hour queen cell we just mentioned, you're probably looking at 22 to 27 days. If you use that day-old larvae, the one that just hatched, we're looking at 26 to 31 days, a month before you get your first eggs. And then you've got to wait 3 more weeks, 21 days. So 21 and 31, that's a lot of days to wait for you to get a new brood emerging from that colony. So you can see that you can save some time and get some buildup. If you've got a long season, this works well. If you don't care what happens, this works well. If you have no great expectations, this works well. Keep in mind that in Mother Nature's scheme of things, you probably lose about 1 queen out of every 4 that goes out to mate because of orientation problems, dragonflies, thunderstorms, whatever comes up, then it can interfere with what you've got. All right, you might want to consider having year-round nucs. These are some year-round nucs in California. They're different style than we have. You could go to the double nuc that we just showed you earlier. You can winter them. Some people are wintering them with, these are 4 frames on each side, so 4 over 4, so you have another box on top with trains of honey. Or you could try what Mike Palmer's doing here in Vermont, and that's simply to put these double nucs on top of a strong colony. And he's got insulation board on there. He's wrapping them with the roofing paper, and he's pretty well moved away from that system. But it's a way of doing a lot of beekeeping, and what you cost here, your equipment, basically. You're working for nothing. You probably have heard that accusation before, but it's a lot of fun to make new colonies. And to me, it's one of the most rewarding things you could do. So we have a book on this that we wrote, and we're now in the 2nd edition on Increase Essentials. You can get it from me, or you can get it from most bee supply people have them. A little personal story. A couple of years ago, I went to California, and my host, the then president of the San Francisco Beekeepers Association, took me to show me her backyard, and she referred to this as a Connor nuc yard because she was, I don't know, she had 14 or 15 mating nucs that she had made up, increased nucs, and she was selling them to beekeepers in the city. And I found out how you move bees in San Francisco. It's called the BART, the Bay Area Rapid Transit. At about 2 o'clock in the morning, you put one of these nucs, seal it up tight, put it into a roll bag suitcase, and it looks like you're coming to or from the airport, and you can take these bees wherever you want. She took me to another beekeeper, 2 guys are actually in an apartment complex, and they each had a colony. So they decided they got nucs. And so they made up 6 colonies, a total of 4 nucs, 4 increased colonies. And here shows the entire setup. There are 4 new colonies. Notice also that windscreen they put up made of burlap, pretty clever. What is that, just PVC pipe? So nice, neat little operation that they had there. And, you know, the scenery wasn't so bad. San Francisco is fun because they have a really good spring and a really good fall. Many of their crops are in bloom then, but it gets, because of the fog and the cooler weather, summer can be kind of unpleasant. Queen Ring books, if you're interested, the original Queen Ring book by Gilbert Doolittle is important. He wrote another book called A Year's Work in the Out Apiary, and that's where I got this whole idea of the Doolittle Nuc, Doolittle increase colony I'll talk about in a few minutes. And then my favorite book is on queen rearing essentials, which we're also in the second edition. So thank you for that. All right, now let me go to some questions if we could. How do I do that? Do I know how to do that?
Click on a Q&A.
Yeah, I just got it had gone quiet here.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Are swarms a concern for package bees? No, unless you don't give them enough room. Will you be commenting on the Asian murder hornet? Well, it's more bad news as far as I'm concerned. We don't want it here. Is it possible cold weather in my area was just too much for them? Anything's possible. It could be a problem with feeding as well. Will supersedure cells exist if they're going to swarm, or just a queen cell? I think what you mean is, do supersedure cells ever swarm? Yes, they do, but usually they don't. Sometimes swarm cells are used as supersedure. These mix things up as weather conditions change. Are there hives that don't swarm? In my opinion, all hives will eventually swarm unless they're just not doing anything. And the only time I've seen that is when their bees are being kept in really marginal areas, like islands that have no food or no weather for foraging. Do you know the function of the bumpy texture of queen cells? That's called sculpturing, and it's probably has something to do with the bees wanting to produce healthy wax. It may have something to do with the energy use of keeping those cells warm and heat dissipation. I don't know. Good math problem, good physics problem right there. I do know that many people do not think that cells that don't have that sculpturing are any good. So that's a factor there. Tim's asking about queen cell as an indicator of a strong queen. I have seen commercial queen producers look at a batch of cells and slam them onto the work table to destroy them all because they thought the cells were too small. So there's a strong opinion out there that cell size is a real issue here. Okay. Where'd they go? Do I use the cloak board? No, I have not used the cloak board. I have no problem against it. I just haven't used it. You can go ahead and try it if you'd like. How much difference is there between a mating flight and a swarm leaving a hive? Is a mating flight that much smaller? Are you talking about a mating swarm? If that's the case, mating swarms might have a few bees, and I'm not really sure that mating swarms really exist, so I have to be convinced of that, Don. Thoughts on the difference between grafted and swarm cells? I think that swarm cells are probably better than most grafted cells, unless you're just doing a super job in your queen rearing. But it's something that a lot of people would say, oh, well, I've had really good purchased queens. And that's what the industry is built on. But you do get some naturally produced queens that are really nice. They're really nice. And that's one reason I like to recommend these bees. Does the queen lay in the queen cup? Yes, she does. If a worker bee has an egg in her mouth, she's probably in the process of eating it. Let that sink in. She's destroying it. Should the split be moved a distance from the mother hive so the workers don't go back? If you make up colonies with a lot of worker bees that are foraging, yes, I would suggest you that. But the next part of my program, how much time have I got left here? Half an hour. So yes, you can make these up and keep them right side using my next technique. Can I tell a drone cell from a queen cell? Yes. They're very easy to tell apart. Drone cells are extending out about a quarter of an inch to 5/8 of an inch, whereas queen cells are completely outside of the area. Now, when you have drones that are being produced between two hive bodies, as you're suggesting here, Kathleen, that can be a real problem. So I'm assuming everybody can see these questions. Is that right? All right. One of the problems that Valerie here is saying is, since queens are often at the bottom of the frames, how do you inspect them without doing damage? You have to inspect your bees very carefully. And if you're making nukes, you have to be careful you don't smash them at the bottom. Sometimes you pick a frame because of where the queen cell is, and for no other reason. Are high numbers of drones indicative of an impending swarm? No. Drones are part of that formula, but they're not a sole predictor. And a lot of people would argue what a large number of drones is. Some people would look at 50 drones, say that's a large number. Other people look at 5,000 and say that's not enough. Okay. Okay, after splitting the hive and the mated queen emerges from her queen cell in the new hive, how long should I wait to add another super? Once those bees have filled 90%, 80 to 90% of the cells in there, then you should go ahead and add another super. And you can always add them, and if you're too early, you'll hopefully get there if the flow is really coming. I think that we have enough drones in the suburbs to get good queen mating from walkaways? I would say in most suburban areas, we have a pretty good population of small scale beekeepers and feral colonies in the sides of buildings, bee trees and so forth. And I know I've made it my goal to let my bees swarm every year in the city of Kalamazoo. So we have lots of bees in the bee trees. I'm joking. What's an effective way to rehome a swarm in your apiary? Not sure what you mean by rehome. Give me another question. If I'm installing a swarm in your colony, once a swarm leaves its parent hive, it's independent of that parent hive. There's no, emails back to mom to say, what do I do next? I'm waiting for a nuke. Am I missing the dandelion and major pollen Charlotte? Okay, probably not. And we've had a really rotten spring here in this part of Michigan, lower Michigan. And I think many people are experiencing the same thing. My dandelions have just started to bloom in the last 3-4 days. What you want to do is get your bees up and running, feed, and get them ready for that clover that'll start in about a month. If you can get a little bit of the black locust, it'll come at the end of the month of May, where we are here in Michigan, that would be good. Sorry if you're not in this area. Not sure. Will foragers gravitate to swarm traps? Yeah, if you've got a good, you're talking about scout bees are attracted to bait hives. They'll be looking before the bees swarm. So getting them out there early is probably good. I've lost where I'm at. Today I noticed that the drones were coming and going. Yeah, they start making orientation flights. They clean out their rectum, and they could be going to drone congregation areas, but this is not part of swarming. So that would be something you want to keep in mind, that drone behavior and swarming are two different things. Drones will go with a swarm. So, all right, let's see. Should I have at least 4 frames of brood before I make a split? It could be as few as 3 or 2. It's up to you. I've made single frame nucs for mating. I'm happiest with 2 frames or 3 frames. I'll brood for making a nuc. I've made them too big or too strong, and then my nucs have swarmed. Full confession here. Do you find virgin queens making multiple mating flights? Most virgin queens mate once, make one mating flight, and mate multiple times in that flight. So, okay, what are my thoughts about OTS notching? No experience. How do you determine a virgin queen from a mated queen? Virgin queens are shorter. Their abdomens are not swollen, and they're usually diving below the V's, looking for a sister to kill, and not strutting around proud like a mated queen would be. So they look stealthy. They could be a virgin queen, but some mated queens can be pretty stealthy. All right, as I said this, John, that you will get, during swarming, you'll get multiple queen cells and they don't kill each other. They're gonna wait until the swarming process is over. Do workers or drones accompany the mating queen back on the mating flight? I generally say no. There are people that say opposite of that. I haven't had experience of seeing that. All right, let's stop with this one where I get a thank you. Thank you so much. We'll get back to these in a minute. I'm not done yet, so I want to go ahead and finish what I want to show you, which is the Doolittle method. Get rid of this. Oh, you don't want that. So what I've been working on. Okay. No, you don't want that either. I had too many things on my desktop. I think this is what we want. Okay. So to finish this off, I want to talk about the Doolittle method, and some of this is redundant to what we've already talked about. So, we've talked about all of these things, mating queens. We can store queen. No, we didn't talk about that. You can have a spare queen in an apiary that if your colony, your big colony is just gone queenless, you've got something you can work with. You've got resources, frame of brood, frame of pollen, whatever you need in another colony, you have this available. And you can actually boost colonies going into honey production with a frame of emerging bees to try to get more bees in that colony to make more honey. People call them brood factories. That's Mike Palmer's term. Dewey Karen and I refer to them as support hives in our textbook. So these are things that we're working on. You can have nuclei winter and have them available in the spring, sell them for a big price, generate income, all those things. So here's one of my colonies in the backyard, and a couple of years ago, I'm just going to, it was May 15th, 2012, and the colony had overwintered. Now I have smoked these, so they've gone down a little bit, but taken off the first box, 2 8-frame boxes, and you can see that we've got an average bee population, nothing special. But we can make this split even though we don't have a lot of bees. I say a lot of bees. To me, it's not a lot of bees. Some of you say, oh my God, look at all those bees. That's what experience can give you. So we're going to take frames of brood and bees out of this, but we'll do it just by doing the brood first. And we're going to look through here. We're going to find frames of with bees on them, or brood on them, and we're going to pick out a couple. We're not going to look for the queen. No effort here to find the queen at all. So we're just going to pick out these frames and say that would be nice to have that. And we set the frames down on the side of the hive or into an empty box if you have one there. And we're going to pick out, I think I've got 3 frames with brood on it and a frame of honey and a frame with a little bit of pollen. Then we're going to replace I'm going to put frames back where we took them out. So now we've got a full box. Set the second box on. On top of that second box, we're going to put a queen excluder. Now this is a fancy schmancy one. Somebody made this and gave it to me, and I appreciate that. It fits a 5-frame nuc box. And if you don't have this fancy version, you can use your regular queen excluder and 2 boards on either side, and that just holds this down. And this is temporary. You could use a brick or something, hold those boards down. And we're going to put a box up here, and we're going to set the frames in. So let's go through this process. We'll get to pieces here in a minute. Now, you can shake the bees into the box or outside the box. I kind of like doing that. I like to catch swarms and dump them in front of the hive and watch them crawl in. So this is just something you can do. And so the first one, we're just going to come up and tap that box or that frame so the bees are on there. Not a lot of bees on there. And now here's our empty box. We set that frame up there. See, there are not many bees there. And we do that with the rest of these frames. So we're just going to go through here systematically. And as I shake each one or bounce each one on the ground, then I'm moving away, except one frame that might have a queen cell. This one doesn't. But if it has a queen cell I want to use, I don't shake the bees or bounce the bees. I brush the bees because I don't want to do any damage to the queen inside. So here we have another one. We keep putting that in there. And see the shiny parts there, probably drops of nectar that are reflecting in the light. And so we're going to fill this box up. And there's an old queen cell I think that's my honey frame. Not a very good one. A little honey, a little pollen. The bees will take care of that. Now I'm going to add a queen. This is a virgin carniolan queen that we had raised. This is back when we still had the farm in Galesburg. And I carried this out. This is my carrier. I just have a queen inside this JZBZ cage. No workers inside with her, just half a dozen, 8 or 10 bees on the outside. Take her out of this and put her into this hive. But first I have to make sure there is, okay, here's our queen. She was a nice queen. And she eventually mated and did a really good job with this colony. I know the date. My thumb is showing the 511, covering up to 511. So I know how old this queen is from emergence. I'm within my 2-week window of using this queen. And you see the plastic cap that covers the queen candy that's in there. The queen candy is just confectionery sugar and honey. That's probably not legal in some states, but it works. And you just tuck that in there between the 2 frames of brood, and you can see the little tiny plastic handle, if you will, there between the 2nd and 3rd frame. So now we're going to close this up. Now there are no worker bees up here. What's going to happen? Well, it's pretty amazing because we're going to put a lid on this colony. And so the bees that are down below, even some that are down on the outside, are going to go back in the entrance because that's the only way they can get in. I'm going to put a lid on that, remember? And so they're going to crawl up into that nuc box. And what's going to attract them is the brood that's hungry. And I don't think it does any noise or anything, but it's producing a pheromone called the brood pheromone that's going to attract the bees to it. We also have a queen there, so some of the bees are kind of curious about a queen. But remember, we still think we have a queen downstairs. But by shaking the bees, we've made sure we didn't have a queen. That's the key point. We've shaken the bees off. We didn't have to find the queen. So somebody in their first year of beekeeping can do this, which meets my objective of every new beekeeper having two hives and a nuc by the end of their first season. So I've got the box there on the right that shows you where I've brought frames out. I've replaced those frames, drawn comb or foundation. Looks like I used foundation here. And here's our lid, finally. I'm gonna leave this overnight and then come back the next day and move the bees off. Now you could just move that box and just set it all. We gotta look at these bees crawling in. Sorry, I just obsess over watching that. So here's our setup. I had another hive out there. I don't comment on the landscaping. So all the frames are going to go into another box. Why? Because I had a polystyrene box available that I could use. So here you see the bees that have crawled up. And these are all nurse bees. They're not any foragers here. And it doesn't look like a lot of bees, but it's enough to do the job. And they're going to take care of that brood. We've got a little food in there. They're going to eventually have a few bees that are going to emerge and then get older bees, go out and forage. My criticism of this set of slides, I would like to have more honey in here. So now I'm going to take these frames and one at a time, I'm going to lift them out, take a quick check, and put them in this polystyrene box right next door. Now, it doesn't have to be polystyrene. It can be in any empty box. It's just what I had at the house. I had these at the house, I had these at the farm. You never have where you want. So now we sold the farm, so I don't have to worry about that anymore. Don't worry about a lot of things anymore. All right, so you can see the coverage looks pretty good. There's our queen, and we're going to pick up that queen and we're going to take the cap off. So you see the coverage. I see a few bees in there that are scenting. They're still at a point of confusion in this whole thing. So we're going to remove that plastic cap, or if it's a wooden cage, the cork, and take that off. And now the bees can go in, clean up that queen candy, and release the queen. So it's a simple system. It works well. I've done this many times, well, not many times, but I've done this enough to be very confident with it. I've had people like Dwight Wells in Ohio that have done this and had really good success with this. And so I feel pleased that they're able to share this with people. And so now we just set this polystyrene box on its own hive stand, a couple of cement blocks, and you're good to go. This particular colony went on, I think I have follow-up on this. I went on to overwinter the next season, or the next winter, did a good job. It went from the 5-frame box to 8-frame, and then eventually 2 8-frames. So it grew nicely. So here's our setup. We got this parent colony, the empty box, and here's the other colony. We could always take bees from one and brood from another if we wanted, which is one of the things that Doolittle did. And he'd actually make full-size increase. He would take 8 frames of brood out of 2 colonies, and then bees out of a third, and make up full-size colonies that within a week or 2 would need supering. So it was a nice system, and it was a way of maintaining your bee colony count if you have a fixed yard. He was using, I think, 30 colonies in his setup. So we're back on the 24th of May, and we had eggs and larvae in the cells, and the queen was, my virgin queen was marked. She was yellow marked, so I knew it was my queen that I put in there. And as I said, she did a good job, so pretty pleased with that. So it's a simple system, works out well. Just advertised the polystyrene boxes. I don't know if they're still being made. I find them to be very good in terms of heat retention, and then if it gets super hot, keeping the bees cooler. So as long as they've got enough access for ventilation, I think they're fine. So this is a way of you making a new colony from your existing colonies. And as I said before, we've got a book on that. The second edition has that information. Other bee books you want to look at that I have something to do with, the Bee Essentials is our basic starter box book. I mean, Queen Ring, I mentioned that. And then Doolittle's Method. And then our newest book is Package Essentials, which just came out just in time for the virus. And so that's not the final cover, but it's got a lot of photos of bee packages being made and installed, two different methods of installing packages, and also management for the first year. So it worked out pretty well. Okay. I think that's all I have on this. So if you get to my website, you can get yourself a periodic table of honey, and wickwest.com, that's where we live. Our sales are down for the last month, but we've done well with a lot of online sales. We've got it set up so I stay here at home. I'm pretty much locked in, and have all the orders and everything ready for my son to pick up at the door. He ships the stuff, and so far we've done a pretty good job. It's been a good team. So pleased with that. Okay, now we had a couple other questions we wanted to ask. So Pat, if we could go to those. Okay. Number 5, during this virus shutdown, has beekeeping been a good diversion for you? Yes, no, or my significant other is happy to get me out of the house. Okay, so let's go ahead and answer that one. Oh, 150 people say yes. 9 say no. And 13 say my significant other is happy to get me out of the house. Well, that's good. All right, next question, Pat. How much are 5-frame locally produced nuclei sold for in your region? I'm giving you under 100 all the way up to more than $225. And if you don't know, you don't know. So go ahead and answer that. So nobody for under $100. 37 between 101 and 150. 45 from 151 to 175. 41, 176 to 200. 12, 201 to 225. And 7 for more than $225. So what's our, I'd say we're kind of between $150 and $200 for most nukes then. Think about that as you move forward. Is there another question yet, Pat? As you move forward with talking about making increased colonies, that if you could winter colonies and get them. All right, so what's your first major nectar or pollen? So it's not your first plant, but your first major nectar or pollen producer. Maple at 59%. Alder at 1, okay. Willow is 14. Dandelion is 44. Clover is 8. And 8 is for don't know. All right. To me, most of you got it right. I think the maples are probably a lot more important than what we give them a lot of credit, or some people give them credit. There's been a lot of internet publicity about dandelions being important to bees as the first food. I don't think they are. And been working on the revision of our honeybee biology and beekeeping, and one of the things that we're expanding is nutrition. Dandelion misses several of the key necessary amino acids that honeybees need. It doesn't mean that it's a bad thing. It just means that they need to have other food present. Do we have any more questions, Pat? Any more poll questions? All right, we're almost out of time here. I'll have you raise queens. And it's supposed to be using the Doolittle method, the grafting method. Probably should have asked this question first. 12% say yes. Most of you have not raised queens. All right, you don't have to. As you saw during this evening's presentation, you can use these swarm cells or these queen cells to your full advantage when you want to. All right, let's do a few more questions. I got, all right, that's what that was. Okay, so my swarm cell hatches and then she does not kill the other queens. Well, we answered that one. She's in swarming, that's kind of what we expect, that they don't kill your sister. If I catch a swarm, the best way to keep the bees in your apiary? Well, the answer to any colony that you want to put into a box and keep is to give them a good home. And what's a good home? It has to be big enough, but not too big. So if it's a good sized swarm, it's 8 or 10 frame box and a frame of honey and maybe a frame of brood. Those are all things that'll help keep your bees there. I had a swarm that returned to the hive today. Why? Probably the queen wasn't there with her. She wasn't doing her part of that, so the bees will return. I split my hive and put the old queen in a new hive, and a week later, the old hive still swarmed. Why did that happen? Probably because they already had queen cells in production. And so just by moving the old queen, that's not going to cure that issue. Aaron Morris. Hello, Aaron. If I take 3 5-frame splits away and leave the remaining 5 frame with the original queen at the original site, how long should it take for the donor hive to recover? 17 days. I don't know, Aaron. I think that what I've done with that Doolittle method is I found that a 3-week gap between making up a nuke today and then coming back in 3 weeks was a good time for recovery. And of course, 3 weeks happens to be a brood cycle. So I think that may be part of the answer right there. Okay, where'd it go? If a split is a little weak, Any problems in bringing another frame of brood from a stronger hive to supplement? Would you avoid bringing workers along in that case? Generally, you can equalize colonies fairly nicely doing one of two methods. One is to add a frame of brood. If they're young nurse bees, there are not going to be any problems. The second method is to simply swap the location of a strong colony and a weak colony and let the field bees kind of equalize things out. Can you discuss entrance reducer or queen excluders? I'm not sure what you want, Tim, but entrance reducers should be off by now, I think. And I think queen excluders are best used by beekeepers that know what they're using them for. I use that queen excluder to make this split. I'm not leaving it on there. I don't mind having a little brood in my honey super, but I know some people have trouble with that. So, you know, use your own judgment. It's what you want really that comes into play here. I had no brood in my overwintered condenser to a single box. I think you're talking about the queen being a foot and a half from the colonies. Just a couple of workers around here. I think that colony may have tried to leave and they left the queen behind. Don't know. That's a tough one. Can a swarm contain virgin queens along with the old queen? Usually it's just virgin queens or the old queen. But as I said, you could have multiple virgin queens. On the other hand, Mother Nature likes to mess things up. So you might have an old queen and some virgin queens. And I know that Roger Morse at Cornell years ago did a study trying to figure out which bees go with a swarm. And the answer is the ones closest to the door. So I think that indicates that if you had a virgin queen that was caught up in that departing group, she might go with. And even though the old queen doesn't necessarily know she's there, why would she? So that's part of the issue there. Is it too early for splits in southeastern Michigan? No. If you make that split warm with lots of worker bees, then you're good. So that might be a good excuse to add a few more bees to that box. If you're concerned about it, I would wait until the cold spell is over, and I'll probably have to move some houseplants out then too. I'm back in the house. I moved them out over the weekend. You asked about possibility to breed for a 2-queen hive. No, I've not done anything else on that. With the Doolittle split you showed us, can you do that but attach a 1 or 2 week capped queen cell and just attach it to the cell? Yeah, you can, any version. You can use the 48-hour queen cell, a mated queen, or anything in between. And I put it in next to the brood, so you have it, it stays warm. I think that's important. How do I mark a queen? What kind of paint? Tensor model paint works well, but you may want to consider some of the marking pens that the bee supply company sell. I've had trouble with some of those though, because they're notorious for leaking. And I have completely bathed queens in the process of trying to mark them as the paint comes out. So always test those marking pens before you use them. All right, last question. I got the signal here from Pat to close it down. Installed packages on 4/4 in my New York. When should I do my first row alcohol wash check? I'm not sure why those two are together, but you can always do a check for varroa counts anytime you want. Okay, I'm going to bring it to an end there. Sorry we didn't get to everybody.